In 1968, while 16,899 Americans died in Vietnam, Donald Trump received a medical deferment from military service. The reason: bone spurs, heel spurs in his feet. The doctor who diagnosed him, a podiatrist in Queens whose office was in a building owned by Fred Trump, a doctor whose daughters later admitted their father did a favor for the Trump family. A doctor who has since died and cannot confirm or deny anything. Which foot had the bone spurs? Trump cannot remember. Sometimes he says the left foot, sometimes the right, sometimes both. A man who cannot remember which foot hurt so badly that he could not serve his country, but who can remember with perfect clarity every insult he has ever directed at those who did serve. I like people who weren't captured, he said about John McCain, who spent 5.5 years being tortured in a Vietnamese prison while Trump sat in his father's Manhattan office. Losers and suckers, he called the soldiers buried in a French cemetery. The men who died so that Europe could be free. He knew what he signed up for, he told a pregnant widow whose husband had just been killed in combat. Tonight, in San Antonio, Texas, the proudest military city in America, home to Fort Sam Houston and Lackland Air Force Base, Donald Trump will face the people he has spent a lifetime insulting. Not on Twitter, not through lawyers, not from behind a podium at a rally full of supporters. Face to face, in a room full of veterans, Gold Star families, and Americans who believe that service means something. And a woman from Dallas will ask him one simple question. The same question that Khizr Khan asked 8 years ago. The question Trump has never answered. What have you sacrificed? If you served this country, if someone you love served this country, if you believe that those who wear the uniform deserve better than contempt from a man who never wore one himself, stay with this story. Share it with a veteran. Share it with a military family. They deserve to know what is being said in their name. And before we begin, tell me, where are you right now? Are you at home, in your car, taking a break at work, sitting with a cup of coffee on a quiet morning? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from, because this story is for you. For everyone who believes that honor still means something in America. The town hall was held in the Freeman Coliseum, a venue that had hosted everything from rodeos to rock concerts. Tonight, it hosted something rarer: accountability. The audience was carefully selected. Veterans from every branch, every era, every conflict. Gold Star families who had buried sons and daughters. Active duty service members in civilian clothes watching from the back rows. Military spouses who had held families together through deployment after deployment. And in the front row, in a seat that would become the most photographed chair in America, sat Khizr Khan holding a pocket constitution. Next to Mr. Khan was an empty chair. No one sat in it. No one would sit in it. It was reserved for his son, Captain Humayun Khan, who had been dead for 20 years, but whose presence filled the room more powerfully than any living person. Jasmine Crockett walked onto the stage carrying a single folder. Not thick, not imposing, just a few documents, a few photographs, a few pieces of paper that contained the truth about the men sitting across from her. Donald Trump sat in his chair with the practiced ease of a man who had done 1,000 interviews, 1,000 debates, 1,000 confrontations. He was used to controlling these situations. He was used to dominating them with bluster and deflection and counterattack. He was not prepared for what came next. Mr. Trump, Crockett began, her voice calm, almost conversational. I want to start with a simple question. In 1968, you received a medical deferment from the draft. The diagnosis was bone spurs. Is that correct? Trump shifted slightly. That's right. I had a medical condition. Which foot? The question hung in the air. Simple, direct, devastating. Excuse me. Which foot had the bone spurs, Mr. Trump? Left or right? Trump's eyes narrowed. His fingers tapped the arm of his chair. It was both feet. I believe it was a long time ago. Crockett nodded slowly, then opened her folder. Interesting, because I have your selective service records here. In 1968, your deferment listed the right foot. In 2016, when a reporter asked you, you said you thought it was the left foot. Your lawyer said both feet. Your personal physician said he couldn't remember. She looked up at him. A medical condition so severe that it prevented you from serving your country, but no one, including you, can remember which foot it was. That's remarkable, Mr. Trump. Most people remember their serious medical conditions. I have a scar on my knee from when I was 12, and I can tell you exactly how I got it. But you can't remember which foot kept you from serving in a war. The audience stirred. A few veterans exchanged glances. The doctor who diagnosed you was Larry Bronstein, a podiatrist in Queens. Do you know where his office was located? Trump said nothing. It was in a building owned by your father. Fred Trump was his landlord. And years later, Dr. Bronstein's daughters told reporters that their father did a favor for the Trump family. A favor. That's an interesting word for a medical diagnosis, isn't it? Not a finding or a conclusion or a diagnosis. A favor. She pulled out a document and held it up. Dr. Bronstein is dead now. He can't confirm or deny anything. How convenient. But his daughters remember. They remember their father talking about it. They remember him saying he helped the Trumps. They remember that it wasn't really about medicine. It was about connections. It was about who your father knew and what he could do for them. She set the document down and let the silence stretch. So, let me paint a picture for the audience tonight. It's 1968. The Vietnam War is raging. Young men across America are being drafted, shipped overseas, sent into jungles where many of them will die. 16,899 Americans died in Vietnam in 1968 alone. Let me say that number again because I want it to sink in, 16,899. Sons, brothers, husbands, fathers, young men who had their whole lives ahead of them. She paused, her eyes scanning the audience. And in Queens, New York, a young Donald Trump walks into a doctor's office in his father's building, gets a diagnosis of bone spurs, and walks out with a deferment. No military service, no risk, no sacrifice, just a piece of paper and a favor from his daddy's tenant. An elderly man in the audience, wearing a VFW cap with pins from Vietnam, shook his head slowly, his hands, weathered and scarred, gripped the arms of his chair. Now, Mr. Trump, I want to be clear about something. Draft deferments were legal. Many young men received them for various reasons. I'm not saying you broke the law. Plenty of people got medical deferments, educational deferments, hardship deferments. That's not the issue. She leaned forward. The issue is this. A man who avoided service through a favor has no right, no moral standing whatsoever to insult those who served. A man who cannot remember which foot hurt is not qualified to call John McCain not a war hero. A man whose father's tenant wrote him an excuse does not get to call fallen soldiers losers and suckers. She stood up and walked closer to him. You had every opportunity to serve, Mr. Trump. You were young, healthy, wealthy, educated. You could have been an officer. You could have led men. You could have done something meaningful with all the privilege you were born into. Instead, you let other people's sons die in your place. And then decades later, you had the audacity, the breathtaking, unconscionable audacity to insult them. She returned to her seat. I want to speak directly to the veterans in this room for a moment. Many of you served in Vietnam. Many of you were drafted. No choice, no deferments, no daddy's tenant writing medical excuses. You went because your country called. Some of you came back with wounds that never healed. Some of you came back with memories that never fade. And some of your friends didn't come back at all. She paused, her voice softening. I want you to think about something. In 1968, while you were slogging through rice paddies and dodging bullets and watching your friends die, Donald Trump was in Manhattan. His feet, whichever ones had the bone spurs, were propped up in his father's office. He was starting his career making deals, living the life of a wealthy young man with a bright future and no risk of dying in a jungle on the other side of the world. She turned back to Trump. And you know what the worst part is? If you had served and come home and built your business empire, no one would fault you for anything. Plenty of veterans became successful businessmen. Plenty of men who did their duty went on to live full prosperous lives. But that's not what you did. You didn't serve and then succeed. You avoided service and then spent decades pretending you were tough. You dodged the war and then attacked the men who fought it. She gathered her documents. That's not just hypocrisy, Mr. Trump. That's cowardice wrapped in arrogance. And we're just getting started. If you're a Vietnam veteran watching this, if you served while this man hid behind a doctor's note, drop a comment. Share this story. Your service matters. Your sacrifice matters. And you deserve to know the truth about the man who has spent 50 years disrespecting everything you did. Round 1 was over, and the men who had dodged the draft had no answer for the woman from Texas. There are certain things that Americans, regardless of political party, have always agreed upon. One of them is this: prisoners of war deserve our respect. Men and women who are captured by the enemy, who endure torture and deprivation and suffering in service to their country, are heroes. Period. Full stop. No exceptions. Until Donald Trump. Crockett opened her second folder and pulled out a photograph, not of Trump, of John McCain, young, handsome, in his Navy flight suit, standing next to an A-4 Skyhawk. The photograph was taken before October 26, 1967, the day McCain's plane was shot down over Hanoi. The day his life changed forever. I want to talk about this man, Crockett said, holding up the photograph for the cameras to capture for the millions watching at home to see. John Sidney McCain III, United States Naval Academy, class of 1958, Navy pilot, shot down over North Vietnam in 1967, prisoner of war for 5.5 years. She set the photograph down gently, almost reverently. When McCain's plane was hit by a surface-to-air missile, he ejected. The force of the ejection broke both his arms and one leg. He landed in a lake in the middle of Hanoi and nearly drowned. North Vietnamese soldiers pulled him out. And what did they do? They bayoneted him. They crushed his shoulder with a rifle butt. They beat him until he was barely conscious. Then they dragged him to the Hoa Lo prison, the infamous Hanoi Hilton, where he would spend the next 5.5 years of his life. She paused, letting the silence build, letting the images form in the minds of everyone watching. They tortured him. They beat him. They kept him in solitary confinement for 2 years. 2 years alone in a cell with nothing but his own thoughts and pain. They broke bones that had already been broken. They denied him medical treatment. They tried to break his spirit in every way imaginable. She looked at Trump. And in 1968, the same year Donald Trump was getting his bone spur deferment from his daddy's tenant, the North Vietnamese offered to release McCain early. Do you know why? Because his father was an admiral. Admiral John McCain Jr., commander of all U.S. forces in the Pacific. The North Vietnamese wanted the propaganda value of releasing an admiral's son. They wanted to show the world that America's elite were abandoning the common soldiers. She leaned forward. Do you know what John McCain said? He said no. He refused to leave. The Code of Conduct for American Prisoners says you accept release in the order you were captured. First in, first out. McCain wasn't going to go home while men who had been captured before him remained in prison. So he stayed. He endured 4 more years of torture rather than betray his fellow prisoners. 4 more years of beatings and starvation and isolation because that was the code, because that was honor. She picked up another document, her hands steady, her voice clear. And on July 18, 2015 at a campaign event in Iowa, you said this about John McCain. I'm going to read it exactly as you said it because I want everyone in this room and everyone watching at home to hear the precise words that came out of your mouth. She read slowly, deliberately, each word landing like a hammer. He's not a war hero. He was a war hero because he was captured. I like people who weren't captured. The audience erupted. Gasps, angry murmurs. Someone shouted, "Shame," from the back of the room. The moderator had to call for order. I like people who weren't captured, Crockett repeated when the room had quieted. That's what you said about a man who was tortured for 5.5 years. A man who refused freedom rather than abandon his brothers. A man who came home with permanent injuries, unable to raise his arms above his head for the rest of his life because of what he endured, unable to comb his own hair, unable to tie his own tie, carrying the scars of his service in his body every single day until the day he died. She set down the document. You, a man who got a bone spur deferment from your daddy's tenant, said you prefer people who weren't captured. As if being captured were a character flaw. As if being shot down while flying combat missions over enemy territory were somehow less admirable than sitting in a Manhattan office building avoiding the draft. Trump shifted in his seat. John McCain and I had our political disagreements. This is not about political disagreements, Crockett cut in sharply. This is about basic human decency. This is about respect. You could have disagreed with McCain on every single policy issue from immigration to taxes to foreign policy, and you still could have acknowledged that he was a hero. That's what decent people do. That's what Americans do, but you couldn't do it. Your ego wouldn't allow it. She pulled out another document. When John McCain died in August 2018 after a lifetime of service, Naval Academy, Navy pilot, POW, congressman, senator, presidential nominee, the flags at the White House were lowered to half-staff. That's standard protocol for a senator. The flags stay at half-staff until burial. Do you know what you did? Trump remained silent. You raised them back up after one day, one single day, the bare legal minimum for a man who served this country for 60 years. You had to be shamed, publicly shamed by veterans groups, by members of your own party, by the American Legion before you finally lowered them again. Even in death, you couldn't bring yourself to show him the respect he deserved. She shook her head. And later that year, you said publicly on camera for all the world to hear, I was never a fan of John McCain and I never will be. About a dead man, about a war hero, about someone who can no longer defend himself. She looked at Trump with something approaching pity. What kind of person speaks ill of the dead? What kind of person attacks a war hero who is no longer alive to respond? I'll tell you what kind. A coward. The same kind of coward who hid behind bone spurs while better men went to war. The same kind of coward who has never risked anything for anyone but himself. Round 2 was over and John McCain's ghost hung heavy over the room. There's an empty chair on this stage, she said, her voice softening to something almost intimate. I want to tell you who it's for. She pulled out another photograph. A young man in army dress uniform, dark hair, warm smile, the confident bearing of someone who had found his calling. Captain Humayun Khan, born in the United Arab Emirates to Pakistani immigrant parents, came to America as a small child, grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, where he played football and made friends and dreamed about his future. Graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in psychology. And in 2000, he joined the United States Army. She held the photograph so the cameras could see it. So the millions watching could look into the eyes of a man they would never meet. Humayun Khan loved America. He loved it the way immigrants often do. Not as something inherited but as something chosen. He believed in this country. He believed in its promise. He believed that a boy born in the Middle East to Pakistani parents could come to America and become anything he wanted to be. And what he wanted to be was a soldier. What he wanted to do was serve. She set the photograph down gently. On June 8, 2004 in Baquba, Iraq, Captain Khan was inspecting the gates of his base when he noticed a suspicious vehicle approaching. An orange and white taxi moving erratically, heading toward the compound where his soldiers, his people, were stationed. Captain Khan had a choice. He could have run. He could have taken cover. He could have saved himself and left the decision to someone else. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice caught slightly. He didn't. He ordered his soldiers to hit the ground, to get back, to take cover. And then he did something that most people would never do. He ran toward the taxi, not away from it, toward it. A 27-year-old man running toward a car he knew was probably a bomb because that was the only way to stop it from reaching his men. The room was absolutely silent. The car exploded. Captain Humayun Khan died instantly. He was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. The soldiers he saved went home to their families. He did not. His parents received a folded flag and a medal and a lifetime of grief. He was 27 years old. She turned to the front row where Khizr Khan sat motionless. The small constitution still clutched in his weathered hands. His father is here tonight. Khizr Khan. He's holding the same constitution he held at the Democratic National Convention in 2016 when he asked Donald Trump a question that has never been answered. Have you even read the Constitution? Have you ever been to Arlington Cemetery? You have sacrificed nothing and no one. She turned back to Trump. Do you remember what you said about the Khan family, Mr. Trump? Do you remember how you responded when a Gold Star father, a man who had buried his son, a man who had given this country everything he had to give, challenged you? Trump's face was hard. I have great respect for. You attacked his wife. Crockett's voice was sharp as a blade. Ghazala Khan stood next to her husband on that stage. She didn't speak. Do you know why she didn't speak? Because every time she sees a photograph of her son, her heart breaks all over again. She couldn't speak because the grief was too overwhelming, because words cannot contain the loss of a child. And you looked at that grieving mother and said, maybe she wasn't allowed to have anything to say. She let the words hang in the air. You implied because the Khans are Muslim that Mrs. Khan was silenced by her husband, that she wasn't permitted to speak. You took a mother's grief and turned it into an ethnic slur. You attacked a woman who was drowning in sorrow because she couldn't find the words to describe losing her child. She pulled out a transcript. Here's what Ghazala Khan said later in response to your attack. I want to read her words exactly. Walking onto the stage with a huge picture of my son behind me. I could hardly control myself. What mother could? Donald Trump has children whom he loves. Does he really need to wonder why I did not speak? Crockett looked at Trump. Does he really need to wonder? That's what she asked. A mother who lost her son was asking if you could understand her pain, and your response was to mock her, to suggest that she was being controlled by her husband, to turn her silence into a political attack. She set down the transcript and picked up another document. But the Khans aren't the only Gold Star family you've attacked. Let me tell you about Myeshia Johnson. Another photograph, a young black woman in her 20s smiling, holding a small child. Myeshia Johnson's husband was Sergeant Law David Johnson, Green Beret, killed in Niger in October 2017 during an ambush by ISIS-affiliated militants. Law David was 25 years old. Myeshia was pregnant with their third child when she got the news that her husband was never coming home. She paused. A few days after Law David's death, you called Myeshia to offer condolences. That's what presidents do. It's one of the hardest parts of the job. Calling families who have just lost everything. Finding the right words for moments when no words are adequate. Most presidents take it seriously. Most presidents write notes beforehand. Most presidents understand that what they say in that moment will stay with that family forever. She looked at Trump. Do you remember what you said to Myeshia Johnson, Mr. Trump? Because she remembers. Congresswoman Frederica Wilson was in the car with her listening on speakerphone, and they both remember your exact words. She read from the document. He knew what he signed up for. The audience erupted again. People shouting, shaking their heads, some wiping tears. The moderator had to call repeatedly for order. He knew what he signed up for, Crockett repeated when the room had quieted. That's what you said to a pregnant widow. Not, I'm sorry for your loss. Not, your husband was a hero. Not, the nation grieves with you. Just, he knew what he signed up for. As if that somehow made it okay, as if that was any comfort at all. She set down the document. Myeshia Johnson said that call made her cry even more. She said, you couldn't even remember Law David's name. You called him your guy. Her husband had been dead for 12 days and the commander-in-chief couldn't be bothered to learn his name before calling his widow. She spread her hands. Captain Humayun Khan, Sergeant Law David Johnson, 2 American heroes, 2 families destroyed by grief, and you managed to hurt both of them. Not comfort them, not honor them, hurt them, add to their pain, make their worst days even worse. She pointed at the empty chair. That chair is for Humayun Khan. He should be here tonight. He should be alive, 48 years old now, probably with children of his own, probably still serving his country in some capacity. But he's not. He died running toward a bomb to save his soldiers. And his father had to watch you mock his mother's grief on national television. She turned back to Trump. What kind of man attacks Gold Star families? What kind of man insults the parents of fallen soldiers? What kind of commander-in-chief makes widows cry? I'll tell you what kind. A man who has never sacrificed anything. A man who cannot comprehend sacrifice because he has never experienced it. A man who looks at a mother's tears and sees only a political attack to be countered. Round 3 was over. And in the front row, Khizr Khan still held his constitution, still waiting for an answer that would never come. Some insults are so shocking, so fundamentally indecent that people refuse to believe them at first. When The Atlantic reported in September 2020 that Donald Trump had called fallen American soldiers losers and suckers, many people's first reaction was denial. Surely no president would say such things. Surely no commander-in-chief would desecrate the memory of the dead so casually. But the sources were impeccable, and one of them was a Gold Star father himself. Crockett pulled out a thick folder, articles, transcripts, confirmations from multiple sources, a mountain of evidence documenting the undocumentable. November 2018, she began. You traveled to France for the centennial of the end of World War I. There was a ceremony planned at the Aisne-Marne American Cemetery where 1,800 Marines are buried. These are the men who died at Belleau Wood, one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The battle where the Marines earned their nickname. She pulled out a photograph of the cemetery. Row upon row of white crosses stretching toward the horizon. A sea of sacrifice frozen in stone. You didn't go. The official excuse was that the rain made helicopter travel impossible. But here's the thing, Mr. Trump. Every other world leader managed to attend. Angela Merkel was there. Emmanuel Macron was there. They went by car when the helicopters couldn't fly. You stayed at the hotel. She looked at him, her gaze steady and unforgiving. According to multiple sources, including your own former chief of staff, John Kelly, the real reason you didn't want to go was different. You said, "Why should I go to that cemetery? It's filled with losers." The word fell like a bomb in the silent room. Losers. That's what you called 1,800 Marines who died fighting the German army in 1918. Young men, most of them barely out of their teens, who crossed an ocean to fight for freedom, who charged into machine gun fire, who died in mud and blood and rain far from home so that Europe would not fall to tyranny. And you called them losers. She pulled out another document. But it gets worse. According to the same sources, on the same trip, you asked a question that reveals everything about who you are. You asked, "Why should I go?" What was in it for them? You couldn't understand why anyone would risk their life for their country. It literally did not compute. You looked at rows of graves and saw suckers who had made a bad deal. Trump started to speak. That story was totally fabricated. John Kelly confirmed it. Crockett's voice was flat, final, leaving no room for argument. John Kelly, 4-star Marine General, your chief of staff for 18 months. A Gold Star father whose son Robert was killed in Afghanistan in 2010. He confirmed you said those things. Are you calling him a liar? Trump fell silent. Let me tell you about John Kelly for a moment because I think the audience deserves to understand who this man is. He served in the Marine Corps for 45 years. 45 years. He commanded troops in Iraq. He held senior positions throughout the military. And then in 2010, his son, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Kelly, was killed by a landmine in Afghanistan. Robert was 29 years old. She paused. 2 years later, John Kelly stood in front of a group of civilians and gave a speech about what it means to serve, about what it means to sacrifice, about the families who wait and worry and sometimes get the news that destroys their world. He spoke as a general and as a father. He spoke from experience most of us can't imagine. She held up a transcript. And this man, this Gold Star father, this 4-star general, this lifelong servant of our country confirmed that you called fallen soldiers losers and suckers. He said, and I quote, "What can I add that has not already been said? A person that thinks those who serve in uniform or are combatants are suckers because there is nothing in it for them. A person that did not want to be seen in the presence of military amputees because it doesn't look good for me. A person who demonstrated open contempt for a combatant that was a prisoner of war." She set down the transcript. Kelly also said, "You are the most flawed person I have ever met. This is a man who has met dictators, who has met terrorists, who has met war criminals, and he says, you, Donald Trump, are the most flawed person he has ever encountered." Let that sink in for a moment. She pulled out another document and when she spoke again, her voice took on a harder edge. Let me tell you about Belleau Wood since that was the cemetery you refused to visit. In June 1918, American Marines faced the German army in a wheat field in northern France. The Germans had been advancing for months. The French were exhausted, demoralized, ready to break, and the Marines were ordered to stop them. She paused. When their French counterparts suggested retreat, a Marine captain named Lloyd Williams replied with words that have echoed through Marine Corps history ever since. Retreat. Hell, we just got here. She looked at Trump. They attacked through the wheat straight into German machine gun fire for 3 weeks. Not 3 hours, not 3 days. 3 weeks of combat so intense that the ground itself seemed to bleed. When it was over, 1,811 Americans were dead. It was the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history up to that point. She held up a photograph, a painting depicting Marines charging through a wheat field, some falling, all advancing. The Germans gave them a nickname, Teufelhunden, devil dogs. A name Marines still use today, earned in blood a century ago. When a German officer wrote home about fighting the Americans, he said he had never seen soldiers so determined to advance, so unwilling to stop, so utterly fearless in the face of death. She set down the photograph. Those are the men you called losers. Devil dogs. Men who charged machine guns because their country asked them to. Men who died in a wheat field 10,000 miles from home. Men whose graves you refused to visit because it was raining and you didn't want to mess up your hair. She shook her head slowly. What was in it for them? You asked. I'll tell you what was in it for them, Mr. Trump. Honor, duty, the knowledge that they were part of something bigger than themselves. The belief that some things are worth dying for. Concepts you have never understood and never will because you have never believed in anything except yourself. She gathered her documents. 1,800 crosses in that cemetery. 1,800 families who never got their sons back. 1,800 empty chairs at dinner tables across America. Empty for over 100 years now. And you couldn't be bothered to stand in the rain for an hour to honor them. She pointed at him. You know what those Marines would have done if it rained? They would have stood there anyway. They stood in rain and mud and blood for weeks. They didn't get to go back to a warm hotel. They didn't get to skip the hard parts. They did their duty no matter what it cost them. And you couldn't even manage a cemetery visit because it might mess up your hair. Round 4 was over and the ghosts of below would seem to fill the room. Words can wound, but actions reveal character. And in August 2024, Donald Trump revealed his character at the most sacred ground in America. Crockett pulled out a photograph, not from France this time, but from Arlington, Virginia. Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, the burial ground for those killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. The newest graves, the freshest grief. I want to talk about what happened on August 26, 2024. She said, you visited Arlington National Cemetery, ostensibly to honor service members killed in the Abbey Gate bombing in Afghanistan 3 years earlier. 13 Americans died that day. Their families invited you to attend. That part is fine. Former presidents visit Arlington all the time. It's sacred ground and those who wish to pay respects are welcome. She held up the photograph. But you brought a campaign film crew. You took photographs. You shot video for your campaign at a cemetery standing on the graves of the fallen. She let that sink in, watching it register on faces throughout the audience. Federal law prohibits political campaign activities at military cemeteries. This isn't some obscure regulation that no one knows about. It's a clear, unambiguous law designed to keep the sacred separate from the political. Arlington is not a backdrop for campaign ads. The graves of heroes are not props for your social media feed. She pulled out another document. When a cemetery official, a woman whose job is to protect the dignity of that hallowed ground, tried to stop your team from filming, do you know what happened? Your staff pushed her, physically pushed her aside at Arlington Cemetery next to the graves of fallen soldiers. They put their hands on a woman who was doing her job and shoved her out of the way. The audience stirred with anger. The army, your army, the army you were commander-in-chief of, issued a statement afterward. Let me read it because it's extraordinary. The military almost never criticizes a former president publicly. Participants in the August 26 incident were made aware of federal laws regarding political activities on cemetery grounds. There was an incident and a report was filed. She set down the document. That's military language for the president's team broke the law and assaulted our staff. The army doesn't issue statements like that lightly. They serve at the pleasure of civilian leadership. They maintain neutrality. They don't call out politicians. But this was so egregious, so beyond the pale that they had to say something. She held up another photograph, the one that had circulated on social media, the one that would define that day forever. Trump standing among the graves, giving a thumbs up, grinning broadly. But this is what really tells the story. This photograph, you standing among the dead, giving a thumbs up, smiling like you're at a golf tournament, like you're posing with a celebrity, like the graves beside you are just scenery for your campaign commercial. She shook her head in disbelief. Who gives a thumbs up at a cemetery? Who grins next to the graves of 20-year-olds who died serving their country? Who looks at that moment surrounded by the final resting places of heroes and thinks this is a good photo opportunity? What is wrong with you? She set down the photograph. The families who invited you were grieving. They wanted to honor their children, their siblings, their spouses. They wanted to share their loss with someone who might understand, who might help carry the weight of their grief for even a moment. And you turned their loss into a campaign commercial. You used their dead to score political points. You posed for pictures while standing on sacred ground. She looked at him with undisguised contempt. Section 60 is called the saddest acre in America. Every headstone there marks a life cut short. Every grave holds someone's child. Every name carved in stone represents a family that will never be whole again. People visit every week, every day. They bring flowers. They bring letters. They sit on the grass and talk to headstones because that's all they have left. And you walk through it with a film crew, pushing aside anyone who tried to stop you, grinning and giving thumbs up like you were at a theme park. She paused. I've been to Arlington, Mr. Trump. I've walked through Section 60. I've seen the families who keep vigil. I've seen the teddy bears left at children's graves. I've seen the wedding rings placed on headstones by widows. I've seen grown men weep like children because the grief never ends. It never ends. It just becomes part of who you are. Her voice hardened. And you desecrated that place. You turned their sanctuary into your campaign stop. You made their grief about you because that's what you always do. Everything is always about you. Even other people's dead children become props for your narcissism. Round 5 was over and the photograph of Trump grinning at Arlington would haunt him forever. The final round began with silence. Jasmine Crockett did not reach for her folder. She did not pull out documents or photographs or transcripts. She simply sat for a moment, looking at Donald Trump, letting the weight of everything that had been said settle over the room like a shroud. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost gentle, the calm before the final storm. I have one more thing I want to discuss before I ask you my final question, she said. In 2020, American intelligence agencies reported that Russia had placed bounties on American soldiers in Afghanistan. They were paying the Taliban for every American killed. Blood money, a price on the head of every service member wearing the American flag. She paused. You were briefed on this intelligence. You knew about it. It was in your daily briefing. And what did you do? Nothing. You didn't confront Putin. You didn't impose sanctions. You didn't even raise the issue in your many, many phone calls with the Russian president. You called it a hoax and went back to playing golf. Trump shifted. That intelligence was never fully confirmed. American soldiers may have died because Russia put a price on their heads, Crockett said, her voice rising slightly, and their commander-in-chief did nothing. Worse than nothing, you actively dismissed it. You called it fake news. You protected Putin rather than your own troops. You chose the word of a Russian dictator over the word of American intelligence agencies. She shook her head. But that's consistent, isn't it? You've never protected the troops. You've never honored the troops. You've never understood what the troops do or why they do it. To you, they're just props, photo opportunities, things to be used and discarded when they're no longer useful. She paused, then looked directly at him. Mr. Trump, I want to ask you a question. The same question Khizr Khan asked you 8 years ago at the Democratic National Convention. The question you have never answered, the question that has hung over you like a judgment ever since. She glanced at the front row where Khizr Khan sat motionless, his constitution still in his hands, his eyes never leaving Trump's face. What have you sacrificed? Trump opened his mouth, but Crockett held up her hand. Before you answer, let me be clear about what I mean. I don't mean money. You were born rich. Whatever charitable donations you've made, and there are serious questions about whether you've made any at all, you never missed a meal because of them. I don't mean time. You've spent your life doing exactly what you wanted to do. I don't mean comfort. You've lived in gilded towers and luxury resorts and private jets your entire existence. She leaned forward. I mean sacrifice in the way that the people in this room understand it. The way Captain Khan understood it when he ran toward a bomb instead of away from it. The way John McCain understood it when he refused to leave his fellow prisoners behind. The way David Johnson understood it when he deployed to Niger knowing he might not come home. The way every single person who has ever worn the uniform understands it. She spread her hands. Have you ever risked anything for someone else? Have you ever put yourself in harm's way to protect another person? Have you ever given up something precious? Truly precious. Something that hurt to lose for your country. She waited. The silence stretched. You dodged the draft in 1968 while 16,899 Americans died in Vietnam. You got a favor from your daddy's tenant while other young men got body bags. You insulted John McCain while he was dying of brain cancer, a war hero, a prisoner of war, a man who had given everything. And you attacked him while he was on his deathbed. You attacked Gold Star families while they were drowning in grief, parents who had buried their children, widows who had lost their husbands, and you made their pain worse. You called dead soldiers losers and suckers. The men who died at Belleau Wood. The men who stormed the beaches at Normandy. The men who fought and bled and died in every war this nation has ever fought. You desecrated Arlington Cemetery for a photo op thumbs up next to the graves of 20-year-olds who gave everything so you could give nothing. You ignored Russian bounties on American troops. You couldn't even be bothered to protect the living, let alone honor the dead. She stood up. In 78 years of life, you have never once put anyone else ahead of yourself. Never once. Not your country, not your family, not your friends, not anyone. You have taken and taken and taken from this nation, its wealth, its opportunities, its highest office, and you have given nothing back. Nothing. She walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. So I ask you again, Mr. Trump, in front of the veterans in this room, in front of the Gold Star families who have given everything, in front of the 50 million Americans watching at home. What have you sacrificed for this country? The room was absolutely silent. Trump's face was red. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. 5 seconds of silence, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Crockett nodded slowly. Your silence is your answer, Mr. Trump. And it's the most honest thing you've said all night. She turned to face the audience. There are hundreds of veterans in this room tonight. Many of you served in Vietnam. The war he dodged. Many of you served in Iraq and Afghanistan. The wars whose dead he called losers. Many of you have lost friends, lost brothers and sisters in arms, lost parts of yourselves that you'll never get back. She paused. You know what sacrifice means. You've lived it. You've carried it. You've woken up from nightmares about it. And now you know, if you didn't know before, what Donald Trump thinks of your sacrifice. He thinks you're suckers. He thinks you're losers. He thinks you're fools for serving a country that he's only ever exploited. She turned back to Trump. I feel sorry for you in a way. You've lived 78 years and you've never experienced what these people have experienced. You've never felt the bond of soldiers who would die for each other. You've never known the pride of serving something greater than yourself. You've never understood why someone would run toward a bomb instead of away from it. You've never understood why someone would refuse freedom rather than abandon their brothers. She shook her head. You're the richest man in this room, Mr. Trump, but you're also the poorest because honor can't be bought. Sacrifice can't be inherited. Courage can't be faked. And no matter how many flags you hug, how many generals you pose with, how many military parades you throw yourself, you will never ever be one of them. She picked up her folder and walked back to her seat. The empty chair on this stage is for Captain Humayun Khan. He should be here. He should be alive. He should be 48 years old, probably married, probably with children, probably still serving his country in some way. But he's not because he chose sacrifice over safety, duty over self-preservation, honor over survival. He was everything you are not. She sat down. And his father is still waiting for your answer. 8 years later, still holding the same constitution, still asking the same question, still waiting. In the front row, Khizr Khan slowly raised his pocket constitution. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The silence lasted a very long time. And somewhere in that silence, in the space between heartbeats, the ghosts of Belowood and Bakuba and 1,000 other battlefields seemed to gather. They had no voices anymore. They had no bodies, but they were there. They were always there, and they were watching. The men who had called them losers had nothing to say. The empty chair said everything. There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes from never facing consequences. Donald Trump had spent 78 years failing upward. Bankruptcy after bankruptcy, scandal after scandal, lie after lie. And every time somehow he emerged unscathed. He had begun to believe he was untouchable, that the rules which governed ordinary mortals simply did not apply to him. He was about to learn otherwise. The clip of his silence went viral within hours. 30 seconds of nothing, of a man who had spent his entire life talking, unable to produce a single word. 70 million views in the first day. Shared and reshared, commented and quoted, turned into memes that would follow him forever. What have you sacrificed became a question asked not just of Trump but of every politician, every leader, every person who claimed to speak for others. It became a test, a standard, a measuring stick against which pretenders would be judged. But the viral clip was not what hurt him most. The memes were not what kept him awake at night. What hurt him, what would continue to hurt him for the rest of his life was something quieter, something that couldn't be measured in views or clicks or trending hashtags. It was the veterans. For years, they had been the backbone of his base. Not all of them, never all of them, but enough. They liked his swagger. They liked his promises to rebuild the military. They liked that he talked tough in a world that seemed to have gone soft. They overlooked his bone spurs. They explained away his comments about McCain. They convinced themselves that he didn't really mean it when he said the things he said. They couldn't convince themselves anymore. In VFW halls across America, in American Legion posts, in the quiet bars where old soldiers gathered to drink and remember, the conversations were changing. Men who had defended Trump for years were falling silent. Men who had worn MAGA hats were quietly putting them away. Not because they had become liberals. These were not sudden converts to the Democratic Party. But because some things cannot be unseen, some insults cannot be forgiven, and some silences speak louder than any words. The VFW post in San Antonio was the first to take down its Trump banner. Then one in Houston, then Dallas, then the waves spread. Not everywhere, not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly, like water wearing away stone. By the end of the month, hundreds of posts across the country had quietly removed any signs of support for the men who had called their brothers losers. Gold Star families who had stayed silent for years, afraid of the backlash, afraid of being attacked the way the Khans had been attacked, began to speak, one by one at first, then in groups, then in an avalanche of testimony. They told their stories. They shared their grief. They said what they had wanted to say for years, that a men who mocked their children's sacrifice had no right to command those still living. John Kelly gave more interviews. He was done protecting a president who had never deserved protection. He confirmed more stories. He filled in more details. He painted a picture of a man who genuinely could not understand why anyone would serve their country, who asked, what's in it for them, about soldiers who had died for their nation, who complained about seeing wounded veterans because it doesn't look good. He just couldn't fathom it, Kelly said in one interview that was watched by millions. The concept of service, the concept of sacrifice, the concept of doing something for someone else, something that might cost you everything. It was completely foreign to him. I tried to explain it. God knows I tried. But you can't explain color to someone who's been blind their whole life. The military vote began to shift. Not dramatically at first. These things take time, and military culture is inherently conservative, but unmistakably. Polls showed it. A 5-point swing among active duty service members, a 7-point swing among veterans, an 11-point swing among military families, small numbers in the general population, enormous numbers in close elections. The margins that had once favored Republicans by double digits began to narrow, then flip, then widen in the other direction. And in the quiet moments, the moments no poll would ever capture, there was something else. There was shame, deep, burning shame among those who had supported Trump, who had defended him, who had looked the other way when he said the things he said. They had known on some level what he was. They had chosen not to see it. They had decided that other things mattered more, the economy, the judges, the policy promises. They had made a bargain and now they had to live with what that bargain had cost them. The bone spurs became a permanent part of American political vocabulary. When someone dodged responsibility, they had bone spurs. When someone talked tough but wouldn't back it up, they had bone spurs. When someone asked others to sacrifice while giving nothing themselves, they had bone spurs. The phrase entered the lexicon, a permanent reminder of what Donald Trump was and what he would always be. But perhaps the most telling change was the simplest one. In veterans' hospitals across the country where old men lay dying of cancers caused by Agent Orange, of wounds that never fully healed, of memories that would never fade. The television stayed off when Trump appeared. The patients asked the nurses to change the channel. They didn't want to see his face. They didn't want to hear his voice. After a lifetime of service, after giving their youth and their health and sometimes their sanity for their country, they couldn't bear to look at the men who called them suckers. That was the justice. Not legal, not political, just the simple, devastating justice of being remembered for what you really are. Donald Trump had spent his entire life building an image, the successful businessman, the tough negotiator, the winner who never lost. And in one night, in one room, with one question, a woman from Texas had stripped it all away. She had held up a mirror and forced him to see what everyone else could see. An empty man, a man who had taken everything and given nothing. A man who would be remembered not for what he built but for what he desecrated. What have you sacrificed? Nothing. The answer was nothing. It would always be nothing. And now everyone knew. The town hall ended at 9:47 p.m. By midnight, the Freeman Coliseum was empty. The stage was being dismantled. The cameras were being packed away. But someone had left the empty chair. A maintenance worker found it the next morning sitting alone in the middle of the bare floor. He was about to fold it up and put it away when he noticed something attached to the back. A photograph. A young man in army dress uniform. Captain Humayun Khan. Below the photograph, someone had written a few words in neat handwriting. He ran toward the bomb. That's what heroes do. The maintenance worker's name was Miguel Hernandez. He was 64 years old. He had served in Vietnam from 1969 to 1971, the years right after Trump got his deferment. He had never talked about it much. There wasn't much to say. He went, he did his job. He came home. He considered himself lucky. He looked at the photograph for a long time. 27 years old, running toward a bomb. Miguel had known men like that in Vietnam. Men who did the brave thing without thinking about it, without calculating the odds, without asking what was in it for them. Some of them came home. Most of them didn't. Their names were on a wall in Washington now, carved in black granite, visited by millions who never knew them, but would never forget them. He carefully removed the photograph from the chair. He would find out who the Khan family was. He would send it back to them, maybe with a note, just to let them know that their son was remembered, that his sacrifice mattered, that not everyone had forgotten what honor meant. Then he folded up the chair and carried it to storage. But the empty space remained. You couldn't see it anymore, but it was there. It would always be there. An absence in the shape of a hero. A silence in the shape of sacrifice. A question that would never stop being asked no matter how many years passed. What have you sacrificed? Somewhere in Houston, Khizr Khan put his pocket constitution back on the shelf. The same shelf where it had sat for 20 years. Ever since Humayun had first given it to him, he had carried it to the convention in 2016. He had carried it to the town hall in San Antonio. He would carry it for the rest of his life if he had to. Some questions are not meant to be answered. Some questions are meant to be asked over and over until the person being asked finally understands what they reveal about themselves. Donald Trump would never answer the question. He couldn't. There was nothing to say. 78 years of life and nothing to show for it but money and fame and power. The things that disappear when you die. The things that mean nothing in the end. Captain Humayun Khan had 27 years. Just 27. But in those 27 years, he had found something Trump would never find. A purpose worth dying for. A love of country so deep that he ran toward a bomb to protect it. A definition of sacrifice that needed no explanation because it was written in blood. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. The empty chair knew it. The veterans knew it. The Gold Star families knew it. And now after that night in San Antonio, 50 million Americans knew it, too. Some men serve. Some men sacrifice. Some men run toward the bomb instead of away from it. And some men dodge the draft, insult the fallen, desecrate cemeteries, and call themselves patriots. History would remember which was which. The empty chair would make sure of it. If this story moved you, if you served, if someone you love served, if you believe that those who sacrifice deserve better than contempt, share it with a veteran, share it with a military family, share it with anyone who needs to be reminded that honor is not just a word,